some creepy stuff about medieval times. The medieval era, often called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, began around 476 AD, and they spanned for roughly about 1,000 years, ending between 1400 and 1450. I feel like a history teacher right now. Do I really teach you guys so many things? I read comments all the time from people being like,
my teacher started a new topic in school and I already knew about it because of Jessii Vee.
Medieval times are best known for their violent revolts, revolutions, gruesome punishments, feasting, knights in armor, and fairy tale princesses. But we're gonna delve deeper than that. We're really gonna get into it. The first thing is that medieval courts were very unfair. Law and order was harsh in medieval England, and people would have to undergo horrible tests to see if they were guilty or not. So here are some examples of these tests. There was something called ordeal by fire, which is where the accused person would hold out their hand and a red hot iron bar would be placed on top of the skin. And if their hand was healed after 3 days, that means they were not guilty. But if it wasn't healed, they were guilty. Makes so much sense, right? Then there was something called the ordeal by water, which is where an accused person was tied up and thrown into a pond. And if they floated, then they were guilty. And if they sank, then they weren't guilty. But a lot of people back then couldn't swim, so this too didn't make any sense. And then there was something called ordeal by combat. This was used by noblemen who would fight with their accuser, and whoever won was right, and whoever lost was usually left for dead. I am so glad they don't use these methods anymore, my goodness. Then we have some weird facts about the animals from medieval times. The people of that time thought that animals were criminals. Yeah, there are records of animals being taken to court for killing people as well as smaller crimes. Now, I have some examples here that are just so mind-boggling. Mice had to go to trial for stealing part of the harvest, and then a swarm of locusts were convicted for eating the crops. Are you kidding me right now? And then we have the weird facts about how they used to eat swans. Nowadays, our royal swans are strictly off limits. However, in medieval times, they were a delicacy of the upper classes. Here are some of what the swan dishes were called. We have roasted swan in entrail sauce, Christmas swan pie, and roast cygnet, which just meant the swan was stuffed with beef. Also on the menu might be peacocks, turtle doves, cranes, storks, sparrows, herons, and blackbirds. Thank goodness that has changed as well. Unless you still eat this stuff in that case. Interesting. England also used to be the native home of brown bears, but they became extinct around the 11th century before having been imported back into the country for sport. So bears literally went extinct in England for a little while, and then they brought them back in to use them for like circuses and horrible things like that. The next weird fact is that they had hallucinogenic bread. Summer was a difficult time for villagers who often ran out of grain before the new crop could be harvested, so they had to resort to old rye to make the bread. Unfortunately, stored rye could be infected with ergot, which is a fungus that caused hallucinations, gangrene, and even death. When you would eat old bread like this, it would cause this burning sensation all over your body, and they called this Saint Anthony's fire. And there are stories of entire communities affected by this fungus, with scores of them cutting off their own limbs to try to stop the burning. And this is just all caused by bread. That's crazy. Then we have a weird fact about how early kids were kicked out of their parents' houses. In the 21st century, kids are staying with their parents for much longer than had previously been the norm. In medieval England, kids were kept in their parents' home till the age of 7 or 9 at the utmost. That is really, really, really young. And basically at that age, they were kicked out of a house to go live off their own lives, working and doing their own thing. And this happened to rich kids, poor kids, it literally didn't matter. Imagine sending your first grader out the door and being like, good luck out there, you'll be fine. Alright, next we have something called tooth worms. In medieval England, anyone going to the dentist risked hearing that they suffered from an infection of tooth worms. Back then, they literally thought that worms lived inside of our teeth, causing them to decay. So whenever the dentists would see holes in our teeth, which are actually cavities in real life as we know, they thought it was caused by a worm entering your tooth. And this worm apparently looked like an eel. And one way of getting rid of the worm was to take a candle made from sheep's fat and a mix of seeds, and to burn it as near the tooth as possible. The idea was that the worm would run from the heat and would fall into a dish of water that was being held beneath the person's mouth. So, yeah. Makes a lot of sense. The next fact is that clown shoes were in style. From the 1330s onward, men considered long-toed shoes as the height of fashion. By the late 14th century, the toes of shoes were so long that they had to be reinforced with wool, moss, or whalebone, and nobles had to tie their shoes to their leggings in order to get around. They were literally so long you couldn't walk. You had to like curl the ends of your shoes upwards to your pants. What? Another fact is that sculptures back then were often drain pipes. Contrary to popular belief, gargoyles were not added to churches to ward off evil spirits, but to drain rainwater. Projecting out from the building, rain would flow out of their mouths and away from the building, rather than down the walls, therefore causing damage. But why did they have to make them so creepy looking? Why couldn't they have looked happier, more positive, not so scary? And then we have the strange tombs of the time. There was a type of tomb called transy tombs, which would display a sculpture of the deceased in an advanced state of decomposition, sometimes being eaten by snakes and other creatures. So like when you died, you would have like a sculpture of like your normal self, and then underneath that sculpture they would make another sculpture of you like all decomposing. And don't worry, all the pictures I'm showing are just sculptures. They're not like real creepy people, they're just made out of stone. Many modern scholars believe medieval people were inspired to create transy tombs in order to cope with their relationship with death and the inevitable end that they were going to personally endure. That's still really like depressing and horrible. But yeah, anyways guys, those are all of the creepy facts I'm going to be talking about today, but there are so many more I could do. So if you want me to make a part 2 to this video, give this video a thumbs up and let me know. Alright guys, let's just jump right into today's video, and I just want to warn you, everything I'm going to be talking about today is pretty gross. I feel like all the facts I collected are just bleh. Because first we're going to be starting with earwax. And yes, we all have it, even you watching right now. You have earwax in there, maybe not a lot, or maybe there's a lot, I don't know. When you visited a doctor in ancient Greece, you could pretty much count on him reaching into your ear and taking a little nibble of your earwax. That is how your doctor would get a diagnosis. He would taste your bodily fluids. Like imagine going to your doctor because you have like a cold or something, and he's like, okay, let me look in your ear. And you're like, cool, totally normal. He's just checking the color, checking to see if I have too much earwax. And then he reaches in and he's like, tastes like apple pie. Now, while tasting your earwax was the most popular thing to do back then, he might also ask if he could taste your phlegm or lick your vomit. Yeah, you still heard that right. All this started with Hippocrates. He believed that the body was a collection of fluids, that each bodily fluid had a specific taste. So Greek doctors were taught how these specific bodily fluids should taste like. So when someone was sick, they would taste it. If it didn't taste the way it was supposed to, then they would be able to give their diagnosis. Why do I have a feeling that doctors got very sick back then? I can't get over it. Imagine going there and your doctor's like, all right, vomit in this cup. Just like Coca-Cola. Okay, the next fact is that people used to wipe themselves with stones. Toilet paper didn't make its way to Europe until the 16th century. Before then, people had to find their own ways to clean up. Sometimes they would use like a sponge attached to a stick, but not everybody was so lucky. More often, the Greeks would clean themselves with stones. They kept a pile of pebbles where they would go to the toilet, and they would have to grate these hard stones against their butts when they were cleaning up. It was said that 3 stones were enough to wipe. So if you ever run out of toilet paper, head to your garden. Other times they would take broken shards of ceramic pots and scrape themselves clean with that. Some particularly vengeful Greeks would actually etch their enemy's name onto the piece of pot, and then they would just wipe their butts with it. Like, why wouldn't they just use cloth or something? I'm so confused. Okay, the next fact is that athletes sold their sweat. So before competing, Greek athletes would actually take off all of their clothes and would cover themselves in oil. And that was literally how they would perform. Whether they were running or doing some other sort of sport, they would always do it naked. And by the end, they were obviously usually covered in filth. So afterwards, the athletes athletes would just stand there and they would scrape off all their sweat and dirt, dead skin, blood, all off their body. And then a group of slaves would run around collecting all the scrapings and bottling up all the weird, disgusting things that fell off the athletes' bodies. And then the jar of these scrapings would be sold as medicine. People would rub this sweat and goo of other athletes onto their own bodies. They believed that it would calm their aches and pains, or people would just do it so that they could smell like an Olympian. Okay, next is that they used to use crocodile dung as cream. Crocodiles were a bigger part of life for the Greeks than they are for us, and that led to some weird details in Greek medicine. They actually had this warning to people about crocodile bites. It is said that if a crocodile walks back into the patient's home after biting them and pees on the wound, the patient will die. That is just so specific. I guess this would happen so often enough that they actually had to like write about it and make a warning about it. Crocodiles weren't just a threat though, they were a cure too. The Greeks recommended treating scars around the eyes by applying a little bit of crocodile dung as eyeshadow. Why do I feel like so many people also got pink eye back then? Then we actually have the unibrow look. Apparently unibrows were very fashionable back then. It is said that today having a unibrow is considered to be among the highest tier of fashion don'ts. However, back in the days of ancient Greece, the men definitely preferred the eyebrows to be a little more connected than they tend to be now. So if you had an extra fuzzy unibrow, all the men were after you. Then we have testing a Spartan baby's strength. Now this is really disturbing. Before the Spartan baby was brought before a group of elders, he had to go through the wine test. And the wine test is as messed up as it sounds. They would bathe the newborn baby in wine and then would just wait and see what happened. It says that if the baby convulsed and died, it was too weak to be a Spartan warrior. And if that was the case, the father would throw out the baby. He would just throw him away. It says if the baby didn't convulse and die from being bathed in the wine, he would be taken to a group of elders. And these old men would literally just decide the fate of the baby. Like if he showed any sign of weakness, they would get rid of him. If he looked like a strong baby, whatever that means, they would keep him and he would grow up to be a warrior. But yeah, it's just so messed up. Like a lot of these fathers would put their baby on a mountaintop to be left to die if he didn't meet the expectations. The next fact is that when you died, you would carry money with you. In Greek mythology, Hades had a ferryman named Charon, whom you had to pay so that he could transport you to the other side of the Acheron River. And if you couldn't pay, you had to wander along the riverside for 100 years. That's why the ancient Greeks buried the body of their dead with a coin under their tongue, so when they arrived at the river, they could pay Charon to continue on. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Charon? I'm probably not. And the last fact is that Greek statues weren't actually white, which is surprising to me. Even though all the statues from ancient times you see today in museums are white marble, they were once painted and adorned with bright colors. It was only due to aging that the colors chipped off and faded away, so now they're just white. Alright guys, so those are all the facts I'm going to be talking about today. If you like this series and you want me to do more like creepy things that were normal back in ancient Rome, in ancient Egypt, wherever you want me to talk about, give this video a thumbs up and let me know, and comment where you want me to do next. Alright guys, so without further ado, let's get right into today's video. The first fact is that some ancient Egyptian tombs actually had some pretty creepy curses put on them. Now, the most famous one was called King Tut's Curse. The story goes that anyone who was involved with the 1923 excavation of Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb was doomed to suffering and death. Now, at first, everyone thought that this curse was just nonsense, but then one of the men who removed the pharaoh, his name was George Herbert. He died 2 months later from blood poisoning after this tomb's discovery. But the others involved in this survived much longer. It only seemed to be him, but obviously that death must have just been a coincidence. But there are some pretty creepy curses written on the walls of ancient tombs. Thousands of years ago, many Egyptians believed that their mummified body was put in a tomb and any interference with their remains jeopardized their existence in the afterlife. For example, example, there's one inscription on the wall that tells any visitors not to take even a pebble from within the tomb outside. Beware of forcefully removing the stone from its place. So literally don't touch anything, not even the rocks or the stones or the sand. Similar curses were put there to ward off grave robbers, and unfortunately it was a common problem. For example, another curse tells trespassers that anything they might do against this, my tomb, the same shall be done to your property. He also threatened to plague them with the fear of seeing ghosts. And this was at the tomb of Ankh-Mahor. I'm sorry, I'm probably saying this totally wrong. But yeah, anyone who goes and visits these tombs or these mummies, don't take anything, don't touch anything, maybe don't even go there. Alright, the next fact is that ancient Egyptian temples were filled with crocodiles. Some temples dedicated to gods also watched over their associated animals. Ancient Egyptian priests were tasked with taking care of animals as an act of devotion to their god. This was probably fine for the priests and priestesses to deities like the cat-headed Bastet, but you may have been creeped out by the temple to Sobek. Sobek was the god of the Nile who sported a crocodile's head on top of a man's body, and some temples dedicated to him also kept real Nile crocodiles, some even with nurseries for hatchlings. Now, many of these crocodiles in these temples were actually adorned with jewelry and gold. Like, really brave priests would come up and put like jewels all over these crocodiles. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that these animals were fed a fine diet far better than some human Egyptians at the time. And apparently after these crocodiles died, they were also mummified, which is interesting. Then there was something called professional mourners. Now, death was a very big deal in ancient Egyptian culture, which also meant the funeral itself was also obviously a very big deal. One of the most striking traditions was that of the professional mourner. These were women who were paid to act out extravagant grief. In some paintings, they appear to be weeping and disheveled, wailing while they touch the deceased coffin. So they literally would not even know the person. They were kind of like actors, and they would just go there and just give this huge show of crying and being upset. All right, let's talk about the mummification process. After everyone agreed on a price, embalmers would take this tool and they would draw out the brains through the nostrils. You probably learned this in school, right? I did. Then they would make an incision in your belly, they would take out all of your innards, and then they would pour like salt all over the wounds. Now, apparently this was a very difficult process, and it would often take 70 days per person to be completely mummified. Incorrectly preserving the dead sometimes meant that they would return and bother the living. Illness and bad fortune could be blamed on the restless dead if their mummification was botched. And then the angry spirit would have to be shooed back to the afterlife by a priest. So, alright, let's talk about the fake beards. Most statues of pharaohs depict them with long, tightly braided beards, but it was all a lie. The beards were completely synthetic because cleanliness was very important to ancient Egyptians. So for them, that meant keeping their faces completely free of hair. The beards were worn to imitate the god Osiris, who also wore a fake beard. And lastly, let's talk about the blind man. This is a very disturbing story. An ancient Egyptian named Pharaoh was angry with the Nile for refusing to cooperate and stop flooding. So enraged by the river constantly overflowing, he angrily threw a spear into the river. So then, as a punishment for disrespecting the gods, he was blinded. A decade later, he went to an oracle, and this oracle told him that he had to wash his eyes out with the urine of a woman who was completely faithful to her husband. And once he did that, it would cure his blindness. Sounds reasonable, right? So Pharaoh first tried dousing his eyeballs with the urine of his wife, because obviously he assumed that she would be faithful and that was the closest thing to him, right? Well, it did not work. After that, he made every woman he could find pee in a pot so he could pour it onto his eyes, and eventually Pharaoh found the perfect pee. He poured it into his eyes, his eyesight was restored, and then he married the magic pea woman immediately and divorced his wife and actually had her burned to death because her pee originally didn't work on him. He thought that she was unfaithful, and then she died. So yeah, I read this story and I was like, what the heck was going on back then? There's actually a lot more very bizarre stories like this, but yeah, that is the end of today's video about ancient Egypt. There's obviously so many more facts, so if you want me to continue this series, give this video a thumbs up and let me know. let's get right into today's video. Okay, the first weird thing is the life-threatening toilets. Yes, you heard that correctly. Toilets consisted of dimly lit and poorly constructed holes that were directly connected to sewer channels. And since the pathways were unobstructed, dangerous creatures would often emerge from the holes. Flames from methane buildup were also relatively common. Like, imagine sitting down on this toilet and either getting your butt burned off by the flames that randomly come out, or like a snake just pops out at you. Ugh. So before going to the bathroom, the Romans would typically rely on like superstition to protect themselves. So magic spells were literally sprawled all over the wall of the bathrooms. This was to like ward off demons and ill luck, so they thought. They also believed that laughing would expel all of these bad things from happening to them. So they literally had this like humorous graffiti and paintings all over the walls of the bathrooms. So when they sat down to do their business, they would see it and laugh, and the laughing would like scare away the demons. They would also sometimes pray to Fortuna, who was the goddess of luck. And like you probably heard me talking about in other videos, like about ancient Greece, they would use a stick with a sponge at the very end of it to clean themselves, like instead of toilet paper, because they didn't have toilet paper back then. And what's so gross is that they would often have to share this sponge without cleaning it, like they would just pass it around. So like if one user, for example, had intestinal worms, everybody else in that room who used it would also get intestinal worms. It's so gross. And before I continue, these videos are very TMI, okay? So if you're like grossed out easily, I would not continue watching, but they are fascinating facts, but yes, they are a little bit gross. Next, we have a fact about reusing bath water. Ancient Roman bathhouses were masterpieces of art in which the customer could wander about, sampling each cold, hot, tepid, or steam bath. They were extremely ornate, consisting of giant colonnades, beautiful mosaics, and pools with varying water temperatures. Bathing in these places, it was like a vital part of Roman life. Like, it was custom to go and visit these bathhouses daily. And they would do this obviously to get clean, but it was also like important for socialization. So like a bunch of naked people would just be like in these like pools, like just chatting. Like, it was really casual. In these public bathhouses, people usually clean themselves with olive oil, which they scraped off to get rid of dirt and dead skin. And then the same oil that they just used would be collected and like passed around to the next person. It wasn't very cleanly. The next fact is that they would use pee as toothpaste. Many of the ancient Romans would collect their urine in jars and store it away. They waited until it was sterile and had dissolved into ammonia before they used it to clean their teeth and wash their clothes. Now, despite their questionable hygiene practices, the Romans greatly valued like pearly white clean teeth. Like, they believed it would be wasteful to get rid of ammonia, which is why they like saved the pee and waited until it turned into just ammonia and then they would use it. They would also put animal dung on their wounds to heal the cuts and stuff. So I just feel like that's like a bacterial infection waiting to happen, but they did it. That's what they did. Next, we have the vomitorium. The vomitorium is now known as the room where the wealthiest of the ancient Romans would go to purge themselves of food and free space in their stomach so they could continue to gorge themselves during feasts. They would literally eat and eat and eat like crazy until they were so full that they had to get rid of the food so they could eat more. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, just eat until you're full and let that digest. Let it go through you, you know what I mean? Why do they need to like expel it and eat more feasts? I mean, it sounds miserable. And if like one of them didn't want to go to this shared room with a bunch of people, they would go back to their own room in private, and then he would lie down and he would have a servant come up to him and put a feather down his throat to make him, you know? So yeah, it was all about making room for more food. Wasn't very logical. Then we have some questionable medical practices. One of their bizarre treatments included the application of a mixture of crocodile meat and cypress oil for getting rid of acne. And like, if you had a very severe case of acne, they would recommend you take a bath in a mixture of sour cheese and oil. Could you imagine how you would smell after that? For treating warts, they would burn cow dung, mouse dung, and swan fat, and then that was like rubbed on the wart. Some of the cures for headaches included sprinkling wine in which a chameleon had been soaked over the head of a patient. Another one was to touch an elephant's trunk to the patient's head to make them feel better. Another one was drinking water left behind by an ox. And some people would even fasten a fox's genitals around their forehead. I'm sorry, but I had to include this. I just couldn't believe it. For constipation, placing a wolf's bile on the navel was recommended to loosen the bowels. And then there was like a few weird things for people who were suffering with epilepsy. Drinking water taken from a spring at night and then placed on a dead man's skull. Okay. They would like put a nail in the ground where a person had a seizure, and like the superstition told them they would never have one again if they did that. If you went up and smelled the afterbirth of a donkey, it would cure your epilepsy. Or if you ate a pickled camel's brain. The next fact is about drinking poison. The Roman rulers poisoned themselves daily. They did so to acquire immunity against poison in case they were poisoned by a foe or from deceit. So yeah, they would just try to get immune to these poisons, but in the process they would either die or get themselves very, very sick, obviously. And then lastly, some Roman graves had pipes sticking out of them. Roman graves had pipes through which wine, honey, and other food material could be lowered into the grave so that the dead could eat. On the occasion of festivals, the Romans had elaborate gatherings near the burial sites of their dead family members. So literally, they had these pipes coming out of the grave so they could feed their deceased family members like wine and bread and like really good food that they were eating, thinking that like they were eating it in the afterlife. And like there's still pictures of like these pipes coming out of graves to this day, which I find pretty like eerie, but also like that was just totally normal back then. Okay, so let's get into today's video, and I just want to give a quick warning slash disclaimer. Because I'm talking about far, far, far back in our history, I'll probably be showing images of real skeletons. So if that bothers you in any way, this is just a heads up. So this first fact probably doesn't come as a surprise, and that is cannibalism. Evidence of this has been found in multiple sites around the world. One of those places is in Gow's Cave in England. There's skeletons and bones of early humans buried all over the place in there. Some of these instances may have been driven by hunger or survival, but others could have been a part of ritualistic practices. Back then, it was believed that consuming the flesh of your enemies or your deceased tribe members was a way to gain their strength or to keep their spirits from causing them harm. So if like their friend Timothy passed away, he was like, I'm gonna eat him so he doesn't haunt me. And back then it just made sense to them, you know? But I do feel like most of the time it was probably from hunger. There's also remains of the Neanderthals at the El Sidron cave in Spain, which just shows that these things may have been common practice. And caves always freak me out in general, not only because I have claustrophobia, but imagine hiking through one or just going to like tour through a cave somewhere in the world and there's skeletons everywhere and bones everywhere. Early humans were crazy, let me tell you. The other fact is that they were obsessed with human skulls. In certain prehistoric cultures, human skulls were collected. Archaeologists have discovered skulls that were modified or decorated after death. Like during my research, I found skulls with seashells replaced for the eyes. I found some with beautiful stones. I found some with carvings in the forehead, like swirls and different symbols. Some skulls were even painted to create lifelike faces and then displayed. Some early humans even turned skulls into cups, which may have been used for ceremonial rituals. And a lot of skulls were actually found with holes drilled in the very top. And this was apparently one of the earliest surgical practices. Theories thought this was done when someone had a head injury and their head was hurting, or if someone was having a mental health crisis. The village surgeon would be like, come over here. Let's put a hole in your head, that will help. Some even think that the early humans were trying to release evil spirits. Obviously, it did not help and made things worse, and there was infections and deaths from it, and it's all just awful to think about. But there have been hundreds of skulls found with holes in the top. Then we have burials with odd objects. Ancient humans would bury the dead with weird things, sometimes with mysterious stones or tools placed in a circle around the body. Some graves were even found with animal bones, which showed a belief that animals should accompany the deceased into the afterlife. There were actually 2 skeletons found in the Czech Republic that were buried with mammoth shoulders. Isn't it crazy to think about how back then we were just chilling with giant animals like mammoths? And then we have the cave paintings, which honestly, personally, I find the most interesting to look at and do research on. Some of the earliest known cave paintings feature strange hybrid creatures that combine human and animal forms. In the Chauvet Cave in France, one of the oldest and most well-preserved prehistoric art sites, images depict creatures that appear to be part human and part lion or part bird, and this is thought because early humans used to believe in mythical creatures, so I guess they assumed they would look like that. Many cave paintings feature handprints, some so small it looks like they belong to children, and these cave symbols are often some of the most chilling, a lot of the times because they were done in blood. And many cave paintings are located in areas that are extremely difficult to access, often deep within cave systems. And this suggests that the act of creating the paintings was a sacred event, with only select individuals allowed to venture into that part of the cave to do it. Maybe shamans, spiritual leaders. And some cave paintings are really creepy to look at. Like, some are of human-like figures that have blank faces or black hollow eyes, and those ones are just unsettling because the purpose of them is unclear. In some caves, there are paintings that appear to be unfinished or abruptly stopped. This has led to speculation that some ritual or event might have been interrupted during the creation of these paintings. In some cases, maybe some of these humans were chased out by animals or by a natural disaster, or maybe another tribe came in and began attacking them. Cave paintings are so interesting. Go look at some pictures. Although, I'm definitely putting a lot of pictures in this video. Then we have the environment around these people that was obviously very dangerous. The oceans of prehistoric Earth were terrifying places. Massive armored fish like Dunkleosteus roamed ancient seas equipped with bone-crushing jaws instead of teeth. We just talked about all of these creatures in the last video if you want to go see if you haven't seen it yet. Oxygen levels were higher during certain periods of prehistory, and this allowed creatures like insects to grow to massive sizes. Massive insects like Meganura, which is a dragonfly with a wingspan of over 2 feet, flew through the air. And the atmosphere was also filled with more toxic gases like methane and carbon dioxide, making it a dangerous environment for modern humans. And during prehistoric times, the continents as we know them were constantly moving due to tectonic activity, and this shifting often caused massive earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, which could create environmental disasters on a scale that we just don't see today. And there were periods when the Earth was almost entirely frozen over, known as snowball Earth events, and these ice ages occurred millions of years ago, and during these times most of the planet was covered in ice, with temperatures plunging to extreme lows. And that's also why people have been dug up years ago still frozen in ice. So yeah, times back then were terrifying, and so I thought it would be a really interesting video to make because I talked about ancient Egypt, medieval times, stuff like that, and the Stone Age was quite intriguing and scary. Guys, so it's time to get a little bit serious because as you can tell by the title of today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Black Plague, also known as the Black Death. And I can't believe that this has been my top requested video over the past 6 months or so. You guys are dark, apparently. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So how did the Black Plague start? Once again, I feel like your history teacher. The Black Death began in the Himalayan mountains of South Asia in the 1200s. Now, because living conditions back then were really cramped and really dirty, people lived in very close contact with rats. Rats were absolutely everywhere and people just got used to living with them. Black rats were the most common at this time and carried the bacteria called Yersinia pestis. The rats then spread it to the fleas that lived on their bodies. These fleas would drink the blood of the infected rats, which meant they would swallow that harmful bacteria, and then they would go and pass that infection to the humans who they bit. And this is essentially what caused the Black Plague. Now, people back then didn't know that this was what was causing people to get sick. They just didn't have the knowledge or technology to figure that out back then. They actually thought that people breathing in dirty air was the cause of everybody getting sick. They paid no attention to the rats. To make matters worse, black rats traveled on ships that went along trade routes, which is basically a way of moving goods from one country to another, and this helped spread the disease from Central Asia to mainland Europe, and that is where all the chaos ensued. Now, life during the Black Death was extremely unpleasant. If you didn't die from the horrible symptoms of the disease, then starving to death was the most likely possibility. Entire villages were wiped out from the Black Death, so there was no one left to work the land or grow food, so people were sick or they were starving. It is estimated that the Black Death took the lives of 75 million to 200 million people around the world. So let's talk about what the symptoms were. The most notable symptoms of the Black Plague were actually black dots underneath your arms. People would have seizures, vomiting, you might have a violent headache, chills, black boils all over your body, and it was because of these black boils that this disease was actually called the Black Death. A white cross was marked on the door of a house to show that the people inside had the plague, and once the cross was marked, no one was allowed to leave the house. Now, people even walked around wearing masks over their faces to prevent them from breathing in the germs of people who had this Black Plague. And brick-built plague pits were made during the Black Death as people had to carry their own dead to mass burial pits because there literally was not enough coffins to go around. People suffering from the Black Death in Italy were sent to the island of Poveglia in an attempt to stop the disease from spreading. As such, countless Italians died there, and it's rumored that to this day, 50% of the island's soil consists of human ash. Now, humans weren't the only ones to suffer from this disease. Apparently, it also affected cows, sheep, pigs. In fact, so many sheep were affected that it caused a shortage of wool in Europe. Now, there was no particular reason why the Black Death finally came to an end, other than it simply ran out of victims to claim. Like, so many people got sick and died that there was no one left to infect, which is really dark. And there was actually another notable plague outbreak called the Great Plague of London that struck in 1665, and I could do a whole video on that as well if you would like. But I feel like this sort of topic is so depressing, especially because of the times that we're living in now. But it is a huge part of our history, and it is important to learn this stuff, which is why I'm here to talk about it, as dark and depressing as it is. Now, what I found really surprising while doing research for this video is that outbreaks of the Black Death still occur to this day. Like, in modern day, people can still get this. There was actually an outbreak in Madagascar in 2017, and it infected more than 1,800 people, and a few hundred people actually died from it. Now, modern medicine is able to cure this most of the time, but it really depends on where in the world you get it, because not everyone has access to this medication. So let's talk about what people would do for treatment way back in the day when the Black Plague was happening. At this time in Europe, a series of bad harvests had caused a lack of nourishing food, which lowered the population's ability to fight the disease, which meant more people got infected and died. Because if you're not eating the right foods, your immune system just completely plummets. So one form of treatment was to cut open one of those black lumps on your body, and people would cover it with a warm layer of butter, onion, and figs to hopefully draw the poison out, or so they thought. But this method didn't work at all. Another was to take a live frog and rub its belly over the victim's body. And also, this method did not work, and no cure was ever found back then. As a result, most people died within 3 days of contracting this disease, and many even died within 12 hours. They actually came out with this list of things to do to avoid getting the plague. So this list was like passed around the villages to read over. So it says 1, eat and drink in moderation. 2, maintain a household as per a person's status. What? So I guess if you're poor, just stay with the poor, and if you're rich, just stay with the rich. Is that what it means? 3, refrain oneself from abusing the poor people, which is good, but I don't think that prevents you from getting the plague. 4, avoid lechery. What is lechery? Oh, lustfulness. Don't get in relationships around this time. Then we have don't eat fruits, drink good wine, avoid bad thoughts, and stay happy. They thought this would save you. Anyways, guys, those are all the facts I'm going to be talking about today about the Black Plague. Obviously, there are so many more and so many like images and illustrations from history that I couldn't possibly show you on this channel. So if you want to do your own research, definitely go do so because there's so much more to it. I just have to keep it sort of in a zone that is YouTube safe, if you know what I mean. But yeah, if you want me to keep doing stuff like this from history, give this video a thumbs up and let me know. I love talking about this stuff, as sad and depressing as it is. I do love history. Okay, so let me try my best to talk about these medieval torture methods, okay? The first one is called the rack. Victims were laid flat on the wooden frame with their wrists and ankles tied to rollers at each end, and as the rollers were turned, the ropes tightened, obviously gradually stretching the victim's body, which is not good. While that's happening, obviously all of your limbs are dislocated, and this method was particularly feared by people just because of how excruciating it was, and it was pretty brutal to watch as well, because that's the thing, back then in medieval times, they would have a crowd of people watching these things happen. Then we have something called the Judas cradle. The victim was hoisted above a sharp pyramid-shaped seat with weights sometimes added to the legs for an increased downward force. Obviously, you can imagine what happens without me saying it. They sit upon this pointed object, and while a lot of people didn't actually die from this method, they died later on from the infections that they got from it. Then we have the Iron Maiden. I remember seeing this device all the time back when I was in elementary school learning about medieval times. I feel like people just know this one. The interior was lined with spikes of varying lengths positioned to pierce vital organs without causing immediate death. And you know, the door was closed with you in it, causing multiple wounds all over you. And the device apparently was also designed to muffle your screams. Then we have something called the thumb screw. This small but effective torture device used a screw to crush fingers, thumbs, or toes. So you would put your finger between the metal bars and they would tighten it until it started crushing your thumbnail or whatever was going in there. And this pain was so bad that it would cause victims to confess their crimes or tell the truth about what was actually going on. You wouldn't think so, but apparently fingernails and stuff actually really hurt when pressed on. Then we have something called the breaking wheel. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel and the torturer used iron bars to methodically break the bones. The broken limbs were then threaded through the wheel's spokes, leaving the victim exposed to birds and elements. Awful thing about this is that sometimes it would take people days to, you know, pass away, and they would have like shock, blood loss, dehydration while they were sitting there in pain. It's awful. Then we have something called the pillory. Locked in a wooden frame, the victim was left standing or kneeling in public view with their head and hands immobilized. And then often they were pelted with like rotten food, rocks, or they were even like physically attacked by the crowds. And this was almost like a method of humiliation that would last hours and hours. Some people even were on there for days and they would just pass away because of exposure to the weather. There's something called scavenger's daughter. This metal frame forced the victim's body into a tight crouch, compressing the ribs and the organs. And this extreme pressure obviously is awful, and it would leave the victims in agony and usually cause their demise. There's something called the Catherine wheel. After being tied to the wheel, the victim's limbs were systematically broken by a heavy iron bar. Oh, you know what? This is actually just like the other wheel. I'm wondering why this one's called the Catherine wheel. Oh, I just found out why. There was a woman named Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and she was sentenced to be executed by the breaking wheel. But legend says that the wheel shattered when she touched it, leading her to her eventual beheading. And so later on they just named it the Catherine wheel. So for some reason, the moment she touched it, the whole device just like broke. And so they were like, okay, well, I guess Your head's coming off then. Then we have the heretic's fork. This two-pronged metal fork was placed between the chin and chest, making it impossible for the victim to lower their head or relax their neck at all. So any like sort of movement would cause the prongs to pierce your skin. And it was often used during interrogations to prevent the victims from falling asleep, because sometimes these people would be questioned for days on end and they would obviously be so tired and exhausted. But this would not let you sleep. I remember hearing about this next one when I was in school. It's called rat torture. The torturer would place a metal container filled with rats on the victim's stomach, and a fire or hot coals were placed on top of the container, causing the rats to panic and burrow into the only available escape route, which, as you can probably imagine, is the victim's body. The rats would begin to gnaw through the stomach to try and escape the hot flames, and that is just so disgusting to me. I almost feel like this is the worst one to think about. And then we have something called the strappado. The victim's hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope, which was then used to hoist them into the air, and this position caused immense strain on their shoulders and their arms, and in some cases weights were even added to make the whole thing even worse. And this would lead to permanent nerve and joint damage. So those are all the methods we're talking about today. I could do a part 2 because there are a lot of medieval methods, okay? It's actually insane. When I was doing research for this video, I was like, oh, that's not all? There's more. So I hope YouTube is okay with this. At the end of the day, it is for educational reasons. This is a part of our history. It's not a creepypasta, it's not a story. Like, these are real things that people went through and they are taught in schools everywhere. So YouTube, I am an educational teacher right now. Hi guys, it's Jessii Vee, and welcome back to another episode of Everybody Has a Story. This is definitely one of my favorite series that I have on my channel. I just love having friends and family come onto my channel to tell their own stories from their life. And today's video is very special to me because it features my grandma. Now, the reason why I decided to title this video 98% of you won't believe what you're about to hear is because my grandma's story is so unbelievable. She's gonna be telling you guys what life was like back in the 1950s growing up, and it's just so different. It's nothing that you would expect. And the reason why 98% of you guys will be so shocked to hear what she's about to say is because only 2% of my audience grew up when she grew up. I only have 2% of people that follow me that are over the age of 60. A lot of you guys are a lot younger, and even me editing this video and hearing what she had to say, I was mind blown. And it really puts things into perspective for you and shows you how different life was back when she was growing up as to how it is now. So I'm gonna go ahead and let her tell her story of what life was like back in the 1950s. I hope you guys enjoy.
So, I'm the grandma, and I thought that you would be interested in hearing what life was like back in the 1950s growing up as a little girl, because it sure was a lot different than it is now. So I thought I would take it in topics. The first is school, what it was like going to school back then. And there were segregated entrances and schoolyards for the boys and the girls. So we were always at our desks. We had those old-fashioned inkwells and nib pens, so it was kind of messy. And if you had a bad boy sitting behind you, he would dip your braids in the ink. In high school, we sat according to our marks, which is not good, because up in the far corner, right in front of the teacher's desk, was the student who had the best marks, and then at the very back of the room, in the far corner, would be the child who had the worst marks. And to me, that was not good at all, because then everybody knew and didn't treat people well. There was a dunce chair. I had to sit in it once, I remember. And it wasn't because I was bad, it was just because I didn't get my times tables right. And the teacher would put the pointer on 2 numbers and you had to immediately say the answer, and I just got so nervous that I kind of just lost my voice and clammed up, and I had to go sit on the dunce chair with a dunce hat on my head. Then there was a cloakroom, so you didn't hang your coats out in the hall or anywhere else, there was a cloakroom at the back where you hung your coats and hats and mitts and everything. And also if you were bad, you would either go to the dunce chair or you would go and have to be alone in the cloakroom. We walked to school. Kids went to a neighborhood school that was within 10-15 minutes walk. In high school, I had a pretty longer walk, 30 to 40 minutes to get to my school. And in winter with sub-zero freezing temperatures, it wasn't the easiest thing. We had gym uniforms, not shorts and running shoes that we brought from home. We had gym uniforms that we had to wear and choir tunics that we wore. And of course the 50s clothing, which was a lot of fun actually. Girls did not wear jeans to school. We wore skirts or dresses. And there was a rule for how short your skirt could be. If it was more than a little higher than your knees, you were sent home. We did wear those hideous poodle skirts that you've seen, but I never liked them much. Fashionable girls wore stockings with a kind of a seam down the back. The only problem was keeping the seam straight, and girls were often seen leaning over and straightening the seam. We also wore crinolines. They were very stiff and scratchy on your skin though, and put runs in your stockings. I wore bobby socks to school when I was in my early teens, and then nylons as I got older. And like you can probably see in some of these pictures, I also wore saddle shoes or white bucks or loafers. I didn't get new clothes very often, and my mom didn't buy many new clothes for herself either. So when I did get a new dress, it was really special. I had very red hair though, not like you see it now, and my mom never let me wear pink or red colors, so I couldn't wait until I was old enough to get a job and earn some money. And one of the first things that I did buy was, a red dress. Most girls had longer hair and put it up in either braids or a ponytail, but we were told that if our braids or ponytail was pulled back too tight, we would go bald before we got really old. We wore neck scarves either around our neck or our ponytail, and we wore head scarves quite a bit. In high school, we did wear lipstick and some rouge, but false eyelashes and hair extensions weren't in vogue yet. Next topic, home. It was very safe. We could play outdoors really all day long. We had to be home though when the street lights came on. It was a different world back then. We never worried about strangers or things like that. As a matter of fact, we didn't even lock our doors. I went to the store all by myself, even as a little kid, with my allowance to buy candy, chocolates. I think when I was about 11 years old, I got a weekly allowance of 25 cents for doing chores around the house. You could buy a lot of candy for 25 cents. Chocolate bars were 5 cents or 10 cents, and a bag of potato chips, 5 cents. We didn't have TV. TV was not a common thing. It wasn't invented really yet when I was a little kid. We only had radio, and then by the time I was about 8 years old, we got a black and white television set. We watched Lassie and Lawrence Welk and cowboy movies on TV. My mom really liked cowboy movies and books. Also Jackie Gleason, I Love Lucy, The Nelson Family. I thought Ricky Nelson was so handsome. Then there was Father Knows Best and The Howdy Doody Show. And I joined the Mickey Mouse Club, and I had Mickey Mouse ears mailed to me. I watched the Mickey Mouse Club really very faithfully on TV every week. And TV went off the air, I think at around 11 o'clock at night each night. There were no stations to watch after that. It was just a signal that would come on the screen. So there was no point staying up late to watch a movie. On Saturdays, we went to the movie theater. It was nearby, and we went there to see the serials, not something you eat in the morning. That meant stories that didn't end. You had to come back the next week to see what was going to happen next. For example, the movie would stop with a guy hanging for dear life onto the edge of a cliff, and the movie would just finish there. So you really wanted to return the next Saturday to see what was going to happen. We had coal heating, so we had a chute in our basement where the coal man came from time to time to pour in his big bag of black coal to heat our house, and made a lot of noise. And I remember our cat used to like to sleep on the coal pile, and one day he was just shocked and shrieked as he ran up the stairs, and he was all covered with black soot. We had no freezer, just a large block of ice that was delivered regularly, which my mom put in the top section of our fridge, and it was called the icebox. It lasted and it kept the fridge cold until the ice all melted. We had no shower. I can't imagine living without a shower. We only had a bathtub, but the water didn't stay hot that long like a shower does. We had no electric stove. We had a wood stove. We also didn't have a fancy washer and dryer or even a laundry room. My mom had a wringer washer, and you had to be careful. If you had long hair dangling over the wringer, your hair could get caught in it. If you had really dirty clothes, like socks, your mom would rub them hard along a scrub board, and then my mom hung all the clothes outside on a pulley clothesline to dry, even in the winter. They would freeze at that time of year, of course, because they were wet when she hung them out. Then she would bring them into the kitchen and hang them on another line in the kitchen to thaw out. It was really funny to walk into the kitchen shortly after she brought in my dad's long underwear and hung it up. I had to dodge around them to get to the sink, and it really looked so odd, like white, stiff legs with no body inside. We lived in the city and we didn't own a car, so we went everywhere on the streetcar or later the trolley bus. People who did own cars often went for the flashy, bright-colored ones, and they were big. People didn't wear seat belts, and cars had bench seats, even in the front, so you could cram a lot of people into a car then. With no TV, we'd play games like puzzles, checkers. I loved to read books, and I read comic books like Archie and Veronica. We played hopscotch, skipping, or went roller skating on the road. The roller skates would often come unclipped from my shoes though, or the straps come loose and that would send you flying. Many people attended church and Sunday school, and only the kids with bad reputations swore or smoked cigarettes. And tattoos were really only obvious with biker gangs. I don't remember any girls in my high school getting tattoos. We ate pretty simple food, very little packaged food, but we did drink pop, especially ginger ale. I never had pizza till I was about 16, and McDonald's hadn't even been thought of. They did though have drive-in hamburger places where the waitress would come out to your car and took your order and delivered it to your car when it was ready. It sat on a tray that attached to your car window ledge. My mom was always baking pies or cakes or cookies and making homemade dinners and lunches. We had a milkman who came with dairy products. The milk was in glass bottles and had a thick layer of cream on the top of it. And when the bottle was empty, we left it on the front porch for the milkman to pick up when he delivered a new bottle. He came in a horse and a wagon. So did the bread man, who brought fresh baked bread and cookies and sweet cakes in a basket under a nice clean tea towel. It always smelled really good. We did not have cell phones or computers. We had what was called a party line on our phones, so when the phone rang with a certain ringtone, we picked it up. But someone else could be listening to our conversation because we were on a party line, meaning more than one family were on the same line. But if your party line person was listening in on your conversation, sometimes they would sneeze or cough, or you could hear them whispering, and that made you mad, and you'd ask them to hang up the phone. There were no computers invented yet. I learned how to use a manual typewriter, and I got pretty fast doing it. But if you went too fast, all the letters would go up at the same time and get stuck. And if you made a typing mistake, there wasn't much solution for that until whiteout was invented to cover up your mistake. I've always loved music, and I enjoyed everything from classical to rock and roll. I grew up at the start of the rock and roll mania, so one of my favorites was Elvis Presley. I remember seeing him on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time. The network insisted that he only be televised from the waist up because he moved his hips so much. Others I liked were the Everly Brothers, Frankie Avalon, and as I said earlier, Ricky Nelson, just to name a few. You could order fan pictures that were pretty good quality to hang up, so I did that. Then there were the school dances in the neighborhood church basement. The guys were on one side of the gym and the girls on the other. Girls never asked a boy to dance. You had to wait for a guy to cross over the gym floor and ask you to dance. The dances that we did back then were the stroll, the twist, jive and swing, the bop, and a little later, the monkey. I know it sounds cliche, but looking back at when I was growing up, life did seem simpler, less stressful, less rushed. We didn't worry about terrorism, climate change, pollution. We went down to Center Island in Toronto and we swam in Lake Ontario. They didn't close the beaches due to E. coli counts. And if you were bitten by a mosquito or another kind of bug, you didn't worry about West Nile or Lyme disease. Does all this sound unbelievable? With less than a century having passed since I was a little kid, I enjoy all the comforts of the modern inventions, but I miss the simplicity of those days. I think we all need to find our place of solitude in this world we live in. It often seems to be spinning out of control. For me, it has been and continues to be my faith in God. Thanks for listening and for taking this trip down memory lane with me. I hope you've enjoyed it and can kind of picture some of these things. Jessie's going to put some pictures along with this so you can actually see what it looked like.
Alright guys, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I found it just so fascinating to listen to and to edit, and especially when I had to research pictures from the 1950s to insert into this video. I definitely learned a lot. I hope you guys did too. I'm so grateful that my grandma was willing to come on here and tell her story for all of you guys to hear, and now I will have it on my channel forever, so that's super special. But yeah, I hope that really put it into perspective for you guys as to how different life is now.